Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, Chapter 29, Section 2, Nationalist Movements in Africa and the Middle East. Yesterday we talked about nationalist movements in Mexico and upheavals throughout the early 1900s. Here we go. In nationalist movements in Africa and the Middle East. Now, the Kikuyu people in Kenya were outraged. Not only had the British taken their land, but had also treated the Kikuyu like second-class citizens. The Kikuyu were among many African people who resented colonial rule. During the 1920s and 1930s, a generation of leaders, proud of their unique heritage, struggled to stem the tide of imperialism and restore Africa for Africans. Resistance to colonial rule. This is a new heading. During the early 1900s, Africans felt the impact of colonial rule. The Kenya and Rhodesia, for example, white settlers forced Africans off the best land. The few who kept their land were forbidden to grow the most profitable crops, such as coffee and sisal. Only Europeans could grow those. In Kenya, too, the British made all Africans carry identification cards, imposed a tax, and restricted where they could live or travel. Everywhere, Africans were forced to work on European-run plantations or mines. The money they earned was needed to pay taxes on the colonial government. Farmers who had kept their land had to grow cash crops, such as cotton, instead of food. This led to famines in some regions. Increasingly, they lost their self-sufficiency and became dependent on European-made goods. Resistance. Opposition to imperialism grew among Africans. Resistance took many forms. Those who had lost their lands to Europeans sometimes squatted or settled illegally on European-owned plantations. In cities, workers began to form labor unions, even though such activity was illegal under the law codes imposed by imperialist nations. Many Western-educated Africans criticized the injustice of imperial rule. Although they had trained for professional careers, the best jobs went to Europeans. Inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination, they condemned the system that excluded Africans from the political control of their own lands. Some eagerly learned Lenin's writings that claimed imperialism was the final stage of a corrupt and dying capitalist society. In Africa, as in other regions around the world, socialism found a growing audience. Protests. Although large-scale revolts were rare, protests were common. In Kenya, the Kikuyu protested the loss of their land, forced labor, heavy taxes, and the hated identification cards. The British jailed the Kikuyu leaders, but protests continued. In West Africa, women traditionally had controlled the marketplaces and farmland. In the 1920s, Igbo women in Nigeria denounced British policies that threatened their rights and their economic role. They demanded a voice in decisions that affected them and their business activities. The Women's War, as it was called, soon became a full-fledged revolt. Women armed with matches and sticks mocked British troops and shouted down officials who ordered them to disperse. Racial segregation and nationalism in South Africa. Between 1910 and 1940, whites strengthened their grip on South Africa. They imposed a system of racial segregation. Their goal was to ensure white economic and political power and social supremacy. New laws, for example, restricted better-paying jobs in mines and whites only. Blacks were pushed into low-paid, less skilled work. As in Kenya, South African blacks had to carry passes at all times. They were evicted from the best land. which was aside from the whites and which was set aside for the whites and forced to live in crowded reserves, which were located in dry, infertile areas. Other laws chipped away at the rights of blacks. In one South African province, educated blacks who owned property had been allowed to vote on local elections. In 1936, the government abolished that right. The system of segregation was set up at this time and would become even more restrictive after 1948, when apartheid became law. Yet South Africa also home to a vital nationalist movement. African Christian churches and African-run newspapers demanded rights for blacks in South Africa and South Africans. In 1912, educated Africans organized a political party, later known as the African National Congress, ANC. Its members worked through legal means, protested laws, and restricted the freedom and restricted what? In 1912, educated Africans organized a political party, later known as the African National Congress. Its members worked through legal means, protesting laws that restricted freedom from blacks. Their efforts, however, had no effect on South Africa's white government. Still, the ANC did build a framework for political action in later years. Rise of nationalism. New heading. During the 1920s, a movement known as Pan-Africanism began to nourish the nationalist spirit. Pan-Africanism emphasized the unity of Africans and people of African descent around the world. Among its most inspiring leaders was Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey. He preached a forceful and appealing message of Africa for Africans and demanded an end to colonial rule. Although Garvey never visited Africa, his ideas influenced a new generation of African leaders. The Pan-African Congress, led by African-American scholar and active W.E.B. Du Bois, Pan-Africanists tried to forge a united front. Du Bois organized the first Pan-African Congress in 1919. It met in Paris, where the victorious Allies were holding their peace conference. Delegates from African colonies in the West Indies and United States called the Paris peacemakers to approve a charter of rights for Africans. Although the Western powers ignored their demands, the Pan-African Congress established cooperation among African and African American leaders. The word is spelled N-E with a accent, G-R-I with an accent, T-U-D-E. Negritude. French-speaking writers in West Africa and the Caribbean further awakened self-confidence among Africans. They expressed pride in their African roots through the Negritude movement. Best known among them was the Senegalese poet Leopold Senghor, who celebrated Africa's rich cultural heritage. He fostered African pride by rejecting the negative views of Africa spread by colonial rulers. In his poem Black Woman, he used the image of an African woman to reflect on the beauty of Africa. Later, Senghor would take an active role in Senegal's drive to independence, and he would serve as the first president. Egyptian independence. How long is this section here? Don't mind me. My name's John Michael here at Context is Everything Media Network. Please subscribe. Thank you. I really, really would appreciate it. I look at the app a lot, and I'm at 56 right now at the filming of this video, and 57 would feel pretty nice. Thank you for your consideration and your attention if you've made it this far. Egyptian independence. American nationalism brought little political change except to Egypt. During World War I, Egyptians had been forced to provide food and workers to help Britain. Simmering resistance to British rule flared as the war ended. Western educated officials, peasants, landowners, Christians, and Muslims united behind the WAFT party, which launched strikes and riots. In 1922, the British finally agreed to declare Egypt independent. In fact, however, British troops stayed in Egypt to guard the Suez Canal, and Britain remained the real power behind Egypt's King Fahd. In 1930s, many young Egyptians were attracted to an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. This group fostered and broad Islamic nationalism that rejected Western culture and denounced widespread corruption in the Egyptian government. Modernization in Turkey and Iran. Turkey, they were the Ottoman Empire just years before. Now they're not. Let's read about it. Modernization in Turkey and Iran. Nationalist movements brought immense change to the Middle East in the aftermath of World War I. The defeated Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918. Its Arab lands, as you have read, were divided up between Britain and France. In Asia Minor, however, Turks resisted Western control and fought to build a modern nation. Ataturk, A-T-A-T, U with an umlaut, R-K. Ataturk. Led by the determined and enigmatic Mustafa Kemal, Turkish nationalists overthrew the Sultan, defeated Western occupation forces, and declared Turkey a republic. Kemal later took the name Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks. Between 1923 and his death in 1938, Ataturk forced through an ambitious program of radical reforms. His goals were to modernize Turkey along Western lines and to separate religion from government. Westernization. Ataturk swept away centuries-old traditions when he replaced Islamic law with a new law code based on European models. He discarded the Muslim calendar in favor of the calendar based on Western Christian traditions and moved the day of rest from Friday, traditional with Muslims, to Sunday, in line with the Christian practice. Like Peter the Great in Russia, Ataturk forced his people to wear Western dress. He replaced Arabic script with Western Latin alphabet, stating that it was easier to learn. He closed religious schools but opened thousands of state schools to prepare young Turks for the challenges of the modern society. Other reformers transformed the lives of women. They no longer had to veil their faces and were allowed to vote. Polygamy, the custom of allowing men to have more than one wife, was banned. Given freedom to work outside the home, women became teachers, doctors, lawyers, and even politicians. Under Ataturk, the government encouraged industrial expansion. The government built roads and railroads, set up factories, and hired Westerners to advise on how to make Turkey economically independent. To achieve his reform, Ataturk ruled with an iron hand. To many Turks, he was a hero who was transforming Turkey into a strong, modern power. Some Turkish Muslims, however, rejected his secular government. To them, the Quran and Islamic customs provided all the needed guidance, from personal concerns such as prayer and behavior to national matters such as government, commerce, and education. Nationalism and reform in Iran. The success of Ataturk reforms inspired nationalists in neighboring Iran. They greatly resented the British and Russians, who had won spheres of influence in their land. In 1925, the ambitious army officer Reza Khan overthrew the Shah. He set up his own Pahlavi dynasty, with himself as Shah. Like Ataturk, Reza Khan rushed to modernize Iran and make it fully independent. He built factories, roads, and railroads to strengthen the army. He too adopted the Western alphabet, forced Iranian women to wear Western clothing, and set up modern secular schools. In addition, he moved to replace Islamic law with secular law and encouraged women to take part in public life. Although many wealthy Iranians in cities supported Reza Khan, Muslim religious leaders fiercely condemned his efforts to introduce Western ways to the nation. As Iran modernized, it won better terms from the British company that controlled its oil industry. It persuaded the British to give it a larger share of the profits and insisted that Iranian workers were hired at all levels of companies. In decades ahead, it would become a major factor in Iranian economic and foreign affairs. European mandates and the Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism blossomed after World War I and gave rise to Pan-Arabism. This nationalist movement built on the shared heritage of Arabs who lived in the lands from Arabian Peninsula through North Africa. It emphasized their common history and language and recalled a golden age of Arab civilization. Pan-Arabism sought to free Arabs from foreign domination and unite them in their own state. The National Pact, written at First Arab Students' Conference, spoke of this mission. I am an Arab. I believe that the Arabs constitute one nation. The sacred rights of his nation is to be sovereign in her own affairs, to liberate the Arab homeland, to unite all its parts, and to found distinctively Arab political, economic, and social institutions. The Arab Pledge, quoted by Arab Nationalism, an anthology by Haim. Betrayal at the Peace Conference. Territories administered by European nations set up by the Paris Peace Conference outraged the Arabs. During World War I, they had helped the Allies against Central Powers, especially the Ottomans. In return, they had been promised independence. Instead, the Allies carved up the Ottoman lands, giving France mandates in Syria and Lebanon, and Britain mandates in Palestine and Iraq. Later, Transjordan was added to the British mandate. Arabs felt betrayed by the West, a feeling that has endured to this day. During the 1920s and 1930s, their anger erupted in frequent protests and revolts against Western imperialism. A major center of turmoil was the British Mandate of Palestine. There, Arab nationalists faced European Zionists, or Jewish nationalists, with dreams of a homeland of their own. Promises in Palestine. Since the Roman times, Jews had dreamed of returning to Palestine. In 1897, Theodor Herzl responded to growing anti-Semitism in Europe by founding the modern Zionist movement. His goal was to rebuild the Jewish state in Palestine, ever memorable historical home. Soon, some Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, migrated to Palestine. There, they joined the small Jewish community that had survived since biblical times. During World War I, the Allies made two vague sets of promises. First, they promised Arabs their own kingdom in a former Ottoman lands, including Palestine. Then in 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration to win support of European Jews. In it, Britain supported the idea of setting up a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration noted, however, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Those communities were Arabs. The stage was set for conflict between Arabs and Jewish nationalists. Okay? So the declaration was wrong, because this shall not be done to prejudice religious groups that exist in these lands, right? A bitter struggle. In 1930s, anti-Semitism, primarily in Germany and Eastern Europe, forced many Jews to seek safety in Palestine. And despite great hardships, they set up factories, built new towns, and turned arid deserts into irrigated farmland. At first, some Arabs welcomed the money and modern technical skills that newcomers brought with them. But as Jews poured into the lands of Palestine, tension between the two groups developed. Sometimes Jewish settlers brought lands from absentee Arab landowners. In the cities, some Jewish factories owners refused to hire Arabs. Those tensions were heightened by religious differences between Jews and Arabs. Although most Arabs were Muslim, some were Christian. Angry Arabs staged attacks on Jewish settlements, hoping to oust the Jews. For the rest of the century, Arab nationalists battled Zionists over the land that Arabs called Palestine and Jews called Israel. And still, to this day. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a lovely day. I'll see ya again soon. God bless.